Hey guys, this is going to be a lecture video on industrialization notes, notes number 5, immigration notes. So first thing we got to do is go ahead and open up those immigration notes. Now, immigration has taken many forms over the history of the United States. Um, the immigration that we're going to talk about is the immigration of the 1800s. And as we go through this, you might notice that it's a little different from immigration the way it is today. So after the Civil War, many immigrants began coming to the U.S. Now, this time period between 1850 is where the population of the U.S. in most U.S. cities is going to increase tremendously. Tremendously means a huge amount, and the number one reason was because we had a lot of jobs and we needed a lot of cheap labor. So our country at this point in history wanted immigrants to come here, as many as could come because the more and more factory jobs were available, the more and more immigration we needed. So it was like, come here, sign this paper, and you are now a legal resident. Now, why did they come? They came for various reasons. Was number one, religious persecution in their homelands. They wanted freedom of religion that we have here, guaranteed by the First Amendment. Still in Europe at this period, there's still countries that did not let everybody practice whatever religion they wanted. So they come here, they could do that. But primarily, they came for two and three. Two is the economic conditions back at home and overpopulation back at home, meaning there was not a lot of jobs back there, and it was super populated, hard to find places to live. And here in America, we had tons of jobs, lots of opportunities, so they come in huge numbers. Now, these new immigrants that we're talking about in the 1800s, they didn't come from the traditional places you might think of when it comes to immigration. They didn't come from Mexico or Latin America or Asia. They actually came from Southern and Eastern Europe. So these are going to be the immigrants of the late 1800s, and they came from these countries here. All right, so here you can see there's the United States and this is Europe. Now you see how France, point 2, Spain, point 3, these are considered like the better countries of Europe, the western part, and therefore they didn't send a huge amount. Where we did get them from is like from Germany, from Italy, from Russia, huge numbers from them. This is like the lower class of Europe, and this is where the poorer side of Europe was. So they're going to come, and they're going to come in big, big, big numbers. So back to the notes, they came from southern and eastern primarily. They worked in factories, they worked in the mines, they built the railroads, they helped the U.S. grow. And at this point in our history, we really wanted them to come. Now, after 1900, we're going to start getting more and more immigrants from other parts of the country, like from Mexico, Japan, and especially China. Immigrants saw this country as a land of opportunity. Around the world, it was difficult to have chances, and here, with all the jobs and all the opportunities, they just had to get here. Now, the journey to America was difficult. It was long, 8 to 9 days, super crowded. But again, the idea was that they were wanted here, so they came. And they came in huge numbers. Now, this map shows you here how they got here in New York. Now, here on Liberty Island, here is where the Statue of Liberty is, and here is where Manhattan is, the what you consider New York. So the ships would come from the Atlantic, and they would pass by the Liberty Island, see the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty at the time was seen like a big, huge signal of hope. Even in the Statue of Liberty itself, they have a quote that's really famous. It says, "Send as you're tired, send as you're poor, send as your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." Basically, our Statue of Liberty represented how we saw this immigration back then, and it tells you right here as well. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. We wanted them all from all parts of the world. We need more workers, so send them, send them, send them. And like I said, they're gonna come. They're gonna go around, they're going to pass the Statue of Liberty and they're going to land here in Ellis Island. Ellis Island is where they registered. And essentially, they got in a line. Primarily, the line came from different countries, so they spoke the language of those people coming from that country, and they registered them. What's your name? Where'd you come from? Sign here. You are now a legal resident. What does that mean? There is no long process of trying to become a legal resident. That signature made you a legal resident. That's how easy it was. And again, it was easy because they wanted them to come. So they're going to, once they're registered in Ellis Island, another boat will take them off and drop them off here, the southern tip of Manhattan. And now they're in New York. Now it's time to go and figure out where are we going to go and how are we going to live? Where am I going to get a job? So we're going to continue with the notes with notes number 3, the immigrant experience. First thing that they had to try to do one way or another, one form or another, is to assimilate or assimilation, the process of assimilation. And what this basically means is you try to blend in and become more of the area where you came from. So that means that they try to be more American. The problem is these immigrants spoke very little English, and it was hard for them to adjust to America. So what they did is they settled in these things called ethnic communities. And in these communities, they have the same type of people from the country they came from, same nationality, meaning that they would go to a community where they spoke their language from their country, where they had the food their language, the religion from their country. Basically, it looked like a little town in the country they came from. Many felt like they were outsiders because they did not speak English, so they felt really comfortable here in the ethnic communities. Now, back then in the 1800s, ethnic communities were basically a place where you lived and worked, and all you heard and saw and smelled and everything was your home country, and you felt comfortable there, but you didn't want to leave outside. Now, today we still have ethnic communities in our society today, but you don't live in these ethnic communities anymore. They're mostly commercial, meaning for business. One example of those is, oh, by the way, when I say they came in big numbers, they came in big numbers. Look how many people were stuffed into the ship day after day. They came into New York to Ellis Island and then dropped off into Manhattan, and now you got to figure out where to go. And these people, if they all came from Italy, they're going to try to go to Little Italy, the ethnic community of New York. But like I was saying, here today, we do have ethnic communities. This right here is an example of an ethnic community that we have here in Orange County. This is 4th Street in Santa Ana. And as you can see, the colors that you see, the flag that you see, the aguas frescas, the tacos, the music, this represents the culture of Mexico. So you could go to 4th Street and you could be immersed in this culture, and it's almost like you're walking in a little town in Mexico somewhere. This is an example of ethnic community right here in Orange County. There's another version like this in LA that's a little bit bigger. It's called Placita Alvera. Maybe you've been there before, and it's very similar. The culture is expressed through music, through the flag, through the food and drink, and that's so on. Now, the thing about it's really curious here in LA, I mean Orange County, is that a few miles away from 4th Street is another ethnic community, and that is Little Saigon. Now, if you look at the Saigon, it looks very different. It's almost like a different world. Look at the different architecture, the colors of the flag, of the Vietnamese flag, the representing the culture, their food. It's different. It's not tacos like we have here. And the colors and just the way they dress. This represents the culture of Vietnam. And if you're walking through Little Saigon, it seems like you're somewhere over there in Vietnam. Now, the cool thing, like I said, is they're only like 6 miles apart. So this is here Orange County, and right here is 4th Street in Santa Ana, and this is where the you would see that culture of the Mexican culture, the community here, and then you take 1st Street, the major street right here, and you get to Little Saigon, and there you're represented with the culture of Vietnam. And again, only 6 miles apart. So you could wake up, go here. Now here's a cool thing. You see this little thing? That's where I live. So I could go over here and have tacos for lunch in this ethnic community, and then drive over here another mile, couple miles away, and have some pho for dinner. And I experienced two different cultures within a couple of miles away. All right. In New York, it was very similar. So this is the tip of Manhattan, and as you can see, here's Little Italy right here. These neighborhoods here is where people lived and they worked, and all you heard was the Italian language and the Italian culture being represented. Well, look, if you just cross a couple of streets, you get to Chinatown, and now you're walking, and it looks different. I just went to New York recently, and I went to these areas and I was hearing it looked like little towns in Italy. I've been to Italy before. And as we crossed the street, we came over here, the colors changed, the decorations changed, the food changed, even the smells changed because the smell of the food was different. And now we're walking in Chinatown. These are examples of the community that these people who came in these huge numbers had to go find. Now, the thing is, they don't all come from China and Italy. So these ethnic communities existed all over New York, um, but represented other cultures. So there was a little Germany and there was going to be a little Russia or whatever the name is. But these ethnic communities were all throughout New York. So these people felt like they could go there. Now, what about the children of the immigrants, the ones who were born here? They lived in a world where they're stuck in two different cultures. And oftentimes they pay little interest to the culture of their parents, the one that they lived up and grew up at home, because they lived in America and they might have gone to school in America or they went to work in America and they wanted to be more American. So it's kind of, they were stuck in between where they lived at home with their parents' culture of whatever country they came from, and they worked outside in the American culture. Maybe you have some a familiarity with this. It is for me. Like even at my age right now, I go to home And even though I might not have spoken one word of Spanish the whole day, as soon as I open that door of my parents' house and I cross that line, I go from speaking English to, hey ma, ¿cómo está? ¿Cómo le ha ido ahora? Just without even thinking about it. And still, you're stuck in between those two cultures. Now, when I was young, I always had a problem with this because I felt my dad was always trying to make me more Mexican, and I wanted to be more American because that's where I was growing up. So he wanted me to wear cowboy boots and a cowboy hat. I wanted to wear baggy pants and listen to hip hop. He wanted me to hear rancheras. I wanted to hit rap. So, but as I got older, I realized that being one of these first generation immigrants, it's actually pretty great because you get to experience the best of both worlds. You get to listen to the best of both musics from both different cultures, the food from both. Basically, you get to live in the best of both. Now, grandchildren, they tended to be fully assimilated, meaning they was mostly just American, and they tended to be curious about their grandparents' culture. And my son is very curious about my dad. When he was younger, my son would always ask me, "How come my grandpa dresses that way? How come he wears a cowboy hat? How come you don't?" But he never felt that push from me that he had to be more Mexican. Basically, I just let him be what he wanted to be. Now, these immigrants, though, the biggest problem is they tended to keep speaking their own language and they didn't want to speak English at home. So it was harder for them to understand the American culture, and therefore they're going to get into some issues with Americans because they don't speak English. There were groups to help them out, like the immigrant aid societies, and these societies were organized by other immigrants who came here earlier, suffered, and realized we need to do something to try to help these people who are barely coming in, and they try to help them with medical treatment, with housing, jobs, and schools. In terms of schools, immigrants realized that education was important, but unfortunately, they were so poor that they couldn't really afford to send their kids to schools. They had to send them to the factories. So it was important, but rarely was it taken. What is the reaction to these new immigrants? So there's going to be a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. Sentiment just means feelings. There's a lot of anger because they were different. Their ethnicity was different, religions were different. They were just different. They spoke a different language. Their food was different. And for a lot of Americans, they felt like, well, you're in our country now. You got to speak our language, eat our food. You got to act more like us. Many were upset though because immigrants tended to be work really long hours and work for as low pay as possible. And they felt that these immigrants would take their jobs away because they were willing to take less. So we talked about workers making 10 cents an hour. Immigrants would take less than 10 cents an hour because they just wanted a job. They come from countries where there is no opportunity, where people are starving daily, and they come to America and all these jobs, and they don't get it. They don't get why Americans are protesting and fighting back against 10 cents an hour. You should be lucky enough that you have a job, so they would take jobs. They were also the ones that we talked about before, oftentimes were strike breakers. And if you're trying to fight for your rights as a union, and here comes the strike breakers, you're not going to like them. And if they tended to be immigrants, you're not going to like the immigrants either. Um, they also were the ones who signed the yellow dot contracts that they signed a contract saying they would never join a union, which hurt the unions. So another reason why they didn't like them. And this began a movement called the nativist movement. People who basically felt, American-born people who felt these immigrants are going against what we need. They need to go home. They blamed immigrants for more crime, more unemployment, for all these problems. It was easy to blame immigrants. It's their fault. It's their fault. Their fault. If they would just go away, everything will be better. And sometimes in the news, you kind of hear that stuff today, about immigration. They wanted to restrict immigrant rights. They didn't want them to be able to work in all kinds of different places. And that you can't have certain jobs, you can't go to certain schools, and oftentimes this anger would turn to physical attacks, where maybe you lost your job because an immigrant took your job, and then you heard somebody else speaking another language, and you got so angry, and there was violent attacks to immigrants, their homes, and their businesses. So this led to a movement called the Americanization movement. And as it sounds, the idea was simple. We need to make you immigrants more American because if you understood what it was to be an American, then you wouldn't take the yellow dog contracts. You wouldn't be strike breakers. You would speak our language, eat our food, and you could just become American. So how did they push them to become more Americanized? Public schools started to be only taught in English. So if any immigrant children did go to school, they would not teach them in their language. It would be in English, so that way they would learn it. Employees were often forced to take classes after work in English and American culture. The idea was, again, the factory owners told them, you need to speak English, you need to learn about the American culture, you're going to go to these classes. and you have to do it or you won't have a job here. And they try to push the idea of the Protestant religion instead of the Catholic religion in any of these schools. Now, why did this movement happen? Primarily because there was a lot of anger toward immigration. Too many immigrants are coming. Yes, we like when you came before when we needed them, but there's too many of them here. We need to slow this down. Native born people wanted to make them more American so they would understand how America worked and they wouldn't do things like, again, strike breakers or yellow dog contracts. And just straight up, there's a lot of racism against these people who they felt were less than them. Results, immigrants often resented the fact that they had to give a part to their culture just to live here. That they felt, why do I have to change? There's nothing wrong with me and I'm not doing anything wrong. Now, all this starts to culminate, though, in more and more negative feelings for immigrants, and the idea that I said how they were welcomed and they wanted them to come, that starts to slow down. The Chinese were the main force that built the railroads. We talked about this image here. We showed you the image of all the railroads, and eventually in the West Coast, they wanted that spider web of railroads where the railroads went everywhere. And it's going to take many years for those Chinese to build those railroads. But once they're done, basically, our government wanted them to go home, go back to China. But many of these people had been here for 10 years, 15 years, and their attitude is, There is no home but here. We're not going home, we're our home already." And once the railroad were done built, they started moving into cities like San Francisco and Sacramento here in California and starting to compete with regular Americans for the factory jobs available. And that's going to lead to a lot of problems. It led to so many problems that they signed a new law called the Chinese Exclusion Act. They basically said, since you're not going home from this point forward, no more Chinese immigration for 10 years. And it is going to heavily decrease immigration to the US from China. Now, this only meant for workers who were low class workers. If you were a doctor or a lawyer, they still allowed you to come. Just low class workers, the poorest of the poor. We don't want you here for 10 years. They passed a law that said in 1882 that if you're an immigrant working in the US, you must pay an extra tax. Why? Simply because you're an immigrant. That's it. They showed how angry they were with them and how they didn't want him here anymore. Another law that was passed, the Gentleman's Agreement Act. This was Japan. This heavily restricted Japanese from coming into the US. And again, low class Japanese workers. If you were high class, one of the better workers, they still let you come. But ultimately, what this is going to lead to is the National Origins Act of 1924, which severely limited the immigrants coming into the US, especially from Southern Eastern Europe and from Asia. Now, what they basically did is they said, we will give every country a certain number of immigrants that you can send legally to the US. But once that number is reached, you can no longer send people here. So this is going to be done again because many Americans were very upset that so many immigrants would come in and take their jobs. So now each country has a number. And that is very similar to the system that we have today. Every year, immigrants come to our country legally. But once that number is done, no more coming legally. What this is also is the birth of illegal immigration because these immigrants are still going to want to come here, but if they can't come legally, now they're going to come illegally. All right, so lots of laws being passed because immigration became a negative thing when it first was a positive thing. Thank you.